collapse of the euro and the transatlantic monetary system generally has defined a period of tension, leaving leaders of nations with one of two choices: to either break with the doomed financial system or allow for the brutalization of their populations, which means subjugating their living standards to destruction in order to pay back unjustified debt. The population worldwide has been very clear in expressing their decision to break with the system, as the constant demonstrations over the last year make this point. Remember, this is how the global mass strike started, initially as a legitimate protest against food shortages in Egypt. Unfortunately, however, the leadership of nations have instead given in to the tension, allowing themselves to be intimidated by the British oligarchy. In essence, they have sided with the enemy and have since been drawing blood from their own populations to sustain illegal debts through bailouts. As for those among the elected who have demonstrated even an ounce of resistance to the demands of the financial authorities, they have been picked off one by one, some resigning while others were forced out to be replaced by men who will do whatever is necessary to pay the debt. The governments of Greece, Romania, Slovakia, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Germany are those among a growing list who have succumbed to the tension, giving up their sovereignty and leaving their populations defenseless and without a future. Russia and China, on the other hand, have proven a resistance to give into that tension. This resistance, especially if it were joined by a post-Obama USA, is potentially powerful enough to break the global stranglehold of British monetarism, which is currently sinking the transatlantic system. As a result, Russia and China have become the targets of thermonuclear war, with the Russian presidential elections on March 4th marking a key decision point in the process. As Lyndon LaRouche warned on his most recent webcast on February 18th, if Putin wins the presidential elections, I don't think the British and Obama will let him survive. Since he announced his candidacy last September, current Russian Prime Minister and now presidential candidate Vladimir Putin has become targeted with overthrow from British-sponsored color revolution and so-called democracy movements, as well as what amounts to thinly veiled assassination threats in various publications. These attacks will be treated in the body of this report. But first, to really understand the contention between the British on the one hand and Russia and China on the other, we must move away from current events per se and recognize that it is nothing less than a war between a system which wishes to depopulate the human race and one which is inclined to save it, which ultimately gives humanity a chance to pursue its inherent mission of creative self-development. The progress of human civilization, unlike any other forms of life on our planet, is one which is willfully self-developing. This comes through in two distinct but not separate areas. One, an increase in technology, increasing the organization of resources to create more power. Secondly, and just as important, there will be an improvement in the quality of the next generation, the future. This latter effect, the increase in the quality of the population morally, is what actually allows for the required increases in productivity and progress to fulfill the requirement of a universal baseline which is ever accelerating. It is human, moral creativity uniquely, which is in accord with the physical laws of creation. And it is exactly that creativity which is the target of an oligarchy. Under an oligarchical system, this creativity which uniquely defines humanity is undesirable and therefore suppressed and crushed. Presently, people are organized into societies and cultures which allow for that control to manifest with little to no resistance. But this is also exactly why an oligarchical system is inherently doomed to fail. By neglecting what is actually valuable to the universe, an oligarchical system will not maintain itself, but rather it will collapse to the point of extinction of the entire human race. At first, it might seem like the collapsing closed system A, representing the British-run transatlantic economies, simply continues on and on forever, even after it has been intersected by the baseline. One can argue, oh yeah, it's going to get worse from here, but it's never going to get that bad. But, as the baseline continues to increase, the baseline, the requirement of the universe, is actually moving farther and farther away from System A. Taking a different perspective, by laying the baseline down flat, it is clear that what is actually occurring is a complete collapse, not merely a system benignly getting worse, but what could be an annihilation. This end of the oligarchical system is what is defining the political turmoil that we see today. And within that context, there are those who are capitulating to this tension, and then there are those who are prepared to fight.
С учетом предложения возглавить список партии, заняться партийной работой и при удачном выступлении на выборах, моей готовности заняться практической работой в правительстве, я считаю, что было бы правильно, чтобы съезд поддержал кандидатуру председателя партии Владимира Путина на должность президента страны.
Весной следующего года выборы президента Российской Федерации. В этой связи хочу вам высказать слова благодарности за положительную реакцию на предложение баллотироваться мне в качестве президента России. Для меня это огромная честь.
On the 24th of September, 2011, speaking before the United Russia Party Congress, Russia's sitting Prime Minister and former President Vladimir Putin formally announced his campaign to return to the presidency in the upcoming March 2012 elections. And that, backed by current President Dmitry Medvedev's agreement to lead the United Russia Party slate in the Duma elections. This decision was a historical moment for Russia's future, as Putin and Medvedev have evidently demonstrated their commitment to the nation, both in reviving a severely assaulted post-Soviet Russian economy, as well as a clear determination to set the nation on a course of internal physical economic development and frontier scientific challenges, targeting the uncharted territories of Siberia, the Arctic, and space. However, beyond affecting Russian history, the Putin-Medvedev move was one of global significance, a decisive intervention into a British-driven general breakdown crisis of all transatlantic economies. In essence, what the Russian leadership is doing is forcing a polarization in world affairs, offering a clear alternative to a collapsing system. Congratulating the pair, American economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche issued the following remarks.
This Putin-Medvedev move is just the kind of strategic surprise the world needs. This assertion of leadership sends a clear message of defiance against the British Empire's divide-and-conquer games, and represents a major step forward towards a new Pacific-centered recovery program for the entire world. Over the recent weeks, the Putin-Medvedev leadership has taken new initiatives towards cooperation with China, on precisely the basis of high technology development, including space and nuclear, that the world needs in order to get out of the current depression. Once the United States, without Obama, joins with this Russia-China alliance, we have the basis for a great Pacific alliance, which will be the alternative to war and a new dark age. We are already seeing whining and screaming from lackeys of the British Empire about this crucial decision. In fact, they have brought this development on themselves by wrecking the transatlantic economies through deindustrialization and globalization. People in the West have no right to complain. The Putin-Medvedev decision is actually a sign of hope for all mankind. What is required now is for the American population to dump its British puppet president and join with Russia and China to form the great Pacific Alliance that can rescue mankind. This alliance is already in the making, as of the Putin-Medvedev announcement yesterday. Now is the time for American patriots to move decisively to dump Obama so we can join it, and take the necessary measures to save every section of the planet from an otherwise inevitable collapse into the future envisioned by the British financial empire, depopulation and death.
Putin's reflex against the British Empire could be traced back to his patriotic response to the destruction of post-Soviet Russia, which occurred throughout the 1990s. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia was subject to a procedure of so-called liberal free trade reforms, appropriately named shock therapy, which ultimately led to the deterioration of the nation. In addition to the eruption of an illegal economy based on the mass looting and export of Russia's raw materials, ownership of facilities in key sectors of the economy had come into the hands of banking and financial interests. The government of President Boris Yeltsin throughout the 90s, whose economic team was run by a team of free trade young reformers shaped in London, had imposed the system. The nation's science sector was rapidly collapsing. Many scientists were reduced to street peddlers, while others simply fled the country. Comparing the number of scientists and science-related service workers employed by Russia at a peak level of 3.2 million people in the late 1980s, by 1997, it fell to nearly a third of that, to a mere 1.3 million. Drugs plagued the country's youth. To get to the heart of the matter, the country began experiencing the disease of depopulation. Between 1992 and 1998, the birth rate inside Russia fell below the death rate, with the number of deaths outpacing the number of births by at least 1.5 times. In essence, the country had turned into a colony of foreign power to be looted and depopulated. No longer was it in control of its own sovereignty. This was the backdrop to Putin's rise to the presidency in 1999. With the superpower brought to its knees by shock therapy, any move to re-establish national sovereignty by challenging foreign and financial control over Russia would be viewed as a hostile act by the empire. And it was. After the financial collapse of August 1998, Prime Minister Yevgeny Primakov established a number of key conditions to restore the nation's physical economy. These included paying out an enormous backlog of unpaid pensions, salaries, and social benefits to the population, stabilizing the currency, providing credit to the productive sector, and putting caps on energy prices, which for the most part were followed through by the Putin presidency. But on top of that was Putin's explicit policy of expanding Russia's role in economic development, and that in collaboration with its neighbors and natural allies, namely China, India, and Iran, among others. This is best typified by Russia's central role in the development of transcontinental rail and infrastructure corridors, linking Europe and Asia, and its effort to connect the nation's Far East with the North American landmass via bridging the Bering Strait. This represents a direct challenge to those London and Wall Street forces, who, for good reason, see Eurasia as the world's strategic pivot. However, as is often the case with any leader who becomes targeted by British interests, they are attacked not so much because of what they have done in the past, but what they will do in the future. That is, if they are committed to continue their defense of national interests in defiance of the empire. The fact that Putin and Medvedev made that continued commitment explicit last September, countering the bankrupt transatlantic financial system with prospects for a Pacific-centered economic recovery, has made him a marked man in the eyes of the enemy.
Так вот, помни мои слова. Умрем под Москву. как наши братья умирали. И умереть мы обещали, и клятву верности сдержали. Мы в Бородинский бой. Битва за Россию продолжается. Победа будет за нами! Спасибо!
Россия! Россия! Now running for president again, Prime Minister Putin continues his offensive. Speaking at this year's Troika Dialogue Russian Forum on February 2nd, he explicitly addressed the fundamental problems of today's global financial crisis. A crisis which, in essence, he says, is the manifestation of a swollen financial sector that is removed from economic realities, resulting in a destructive process of deindustrialization in the leading economies of the Eurozone and the United States. But going even beyond that generally understood reality, he touches on the real nerve of the matter, that what we are actually facing is the end of a system. It's obvious that the world will never be the same. Considering the change in terms of historical categories, we believe that the issue at hand represents the end of a period of political, economic, and financial domination of a number of states, which has lasted nearly 5 centuries. The main global growth centers are shifting out of the so-called historical West. While the United States and Eurozone, under the homicidal direction of Obama and his British masters, continue to suffer the blows of bailout and fascist austerity, Russia and China are on a different course. Juxtaposed against Obama's destruction of NASA, and European leaders who in search of popularity are shutting down nuclear power in Europe, preferring to return to feudal-era energy sources like windmills. Russia and China, both individually and cooperatively, are aggressively pursuing a nuclear-based economy and manned spaceflight and colonization, knowing full well that if humanity is to continue to exist and grow, these goals must be achieved. Starting from the very top, in space, both China and Russia have developed a series of long-term plans for deep space exploration and colonization. Russia, reminding us of what the United States space program had accomplished under the leadership of President Kennedy, is on a steady course to return human beings back to the moon. Having achieved many of its initial goals laid out in 2000 for a 20-year perspective of space activities, including the first Chinese to orbit the Earth, the first Chinese to do a spacewalk, and 2 successful satellite missions to the moon. China is planning to land a man on lunar soil by the year 2030. In addition to this, the Chinese are also in the process of developing its own space station, with test module Tiangong-1 successfully launched and placed into Earth orbit in September of 2011. Despite continuing challenges from the loss of skilled personnel in space science and engineering following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia is pursuing ambitious goals in space. Having just hosted the Mars 500 experiment, which simulated a trip to Mars for 6 astronauts, the country is planning for an actual expedition to the Red Planet by 2035-2040. And to help meet that goal, the construction of the Vostochny Cosmodrome in the Amur Oblast in the Russian Far East has begun and is scheduled for completion by 2015. The Cosmodrome, in addition to providing Russia with another space vehicle launch complex, will also double as a new science city, composed of research centers, a science academy, an astronaut training center, as well as space manufacturing facilities. But to actually achieve these endeavors in space, a significant amount of scientific breakthroughs will have to be made simultaneously here on Earth, particularly in upgrading humanity's energy platform to nuclear power with an eye towards matter-antimatter, in getting used to conquering uninhabitable territories, and in understanding how solar and galactic forces will impact life and human beings in extended durations outside of Earth's protective atmosphere and magnetosphere. as we have demonstrated in an LPAC feature film, Window to Space, the best testing ground to help us make these necessary breakthroughs exists in our planet's polar regions, in the fringes of what we call Earth, the Arctic and Antarctic. This past September, with the support and attendance of Prime Minister Putin, the Russian Geographical Society hosted the Second International Arctic Forum, poetically titled The Arctic, Territory of Dialogue. This event brought together 450 scientists, officials, and reporters from the nations of Russia, China, the United States, Canada, Norway, Denmark, Japan, and others to discuss primarily the creation of an Arctic transportation system. And among the various recommendations that were adopted, Russia committed to establish a new Arctic Research Center to, quote, give a fresh boost to science in the North, as well as expanding its diesel and nuclear icebreaker fleet for use in the Northern Sea Route. As for projects already in motion, on top of existing agreements between the Russian State Atomic Energy Corporation and the Chinese Nuclear Agency to cooperate on the technology of floating nuclear power plants, which will be essential to bringing power and process heat to remote regions of the world, both nations are respectively developing technologies key to Arctic development as well as actually gaining access to the polar region. Russia is actively pursuing the completion by rail by the year 2030 of the Bering Strait connection, which, with a latitude of 65 degrees 40 minutes north, sits right on the southern edge of the Arctic Circle. In an Obama-free world, the United States will be allowed to complete its end of the Bering Strait connection. But in the meantime, Russia is already in the process of connecting their existing rail grid, which had originally only reached Berkakit, to extend it to Uelin, the Russian side of the Bering Strait. Meanwhile, China, as we know, is leading the world in the implementation and advancement of magnetically levitated rail, which will be a key transportation technology in long-distance transcontinental travel. Travel typified by the Bering Strait connection and the rest of the world land bridge, which the Bering Strait connection is a key part of. Maglev trains, elevated above a track using electromagnetic attraction repulsion, can be run in a vacuum tunnel that eliminates air friction, enabling speeds up to 1,000 miles per hour. Already, scientists at China's Southwest Jiaotong University managed to achieve a test speed of 745 miles per hour, running a maglev in a vacuum tunnel, thus making this rail technology provably faster than commercial air flight. But most exciting are the prospects for a wonder city named Umka, deep within the Arctic Circle on the remote island of Kotelny, presented to Prime Minister Putin at the Arctic Forum mentioned earlier. Only 1,000 miles from the North Pole, the conditions of Kotelny Island are not naturally habitable for human beings. Umka will have to be entirely enclosed, entirely self-sustaining, powered by a floating nuclear power plant, and would require aero and space technologies. In essence, Umka will have to be a revolution in science. As its designer, Valery Rezhevsky, can proudly tell us, this project is designed to work on any surface, even on the moon if needed. And colonization of the moon is exactly what the Russians are thinking of. Not by themselves, but in collaboration with the United States. As Russian space agency Roscosmos chief Vladimir Popovkin offered this January, Russia wishes the United States to join it in laying a pathway to Mars, beginning with the establishment of a permanent colony on the moon. This offer should be seen in the greater context of a serious effort by Russia to recruit the United States to complete the Great Pacific Alliance, and to eliminate the threat of nuclear confrontation currently being fanned by the British. In that light, the Russian government has floated to the U.S. leadership a policy of war avoidance via collaboration, the strategic defense of Earth. Modeled on Lyndon LaRouche's SDI of the 1980s, The current Russian SDE proposal calls for a joint space-based system that will guard against missiles, as well as threats from outer space, such as asteroids. With this system in place, nuclear warfare will become obsolete. Instead of war, the United States, Russia, and China can develop joint defense in space. This is why Russia and China are a threat to those who are clinging onto a presently dying system of monetarism and hyperinflation. Imagine a system which has dominated mankind for thousands of years based on permanent wars, monetarism, and mental slavery. What place will they have in a world typified by a Pacific alliance of major nations? This is why the British is threatening thermonuclear war against Russia and China. However, as it stands, British efforts to ignite proxies to achieve the intended global conflict with the Eurasian powers have failed so far, largely due to the war prevention measures taken by the Russian and Chinese governments and key U.S. circles. Understanding that they are the targets, as well as the consequences of world war in the 21st century, which Prime Minister Putin, President Medvedev, and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov have all publicly warned of. The Russian leadership has made every effort to keep foreign military intervention, or rather invasion, of Iran and Syria at bay. Since the French and US-backed murder of former Libyan ruler Muammar Gaddafi, which provided the basis for war provocation directed at Iran and Syria, Russia has publicly condemned the murder, warning against the eruption of similar violent regime change operations targeting Syrian President Bashar Assad. When US and Canadian naval presence grew in the Mediterranean this past November, posing an obvious threat to the Syrian coast, Russia did not stand idly by, countering the Western presence with its own navy, as a measured action to dissuade any plots of attack on Syria. Also, while the West is screaming for Assad's overthrow and military invasion under the guise of humanitarian intervention, the Russian leadership, typified by Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov's efforts, has made itself responsible for keeping the option of diplomacy open. The UN Security Council in early February made an attempt to force Russia and China to capitulate to the push for regime change in Syria, in the form of a resolution demanding Assad's removal from office, only to be vetoed by the Russian and Chinese delegation. In the case of Iran, which has been targeted by growing sanctions, assassinations, and threats of military strikes, Russia has been keen on maintaining the option of dialogue. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov has made clear that an attack on Iran will not simply be isolated to Iran. At a press conference on January 18th, Lavrov cautioned, "The consequences of a military attack on Iran will be extremely grave. It is not going to be an easy walk. It will trigger a chain reaction, and I don't know where it will stop." He also pointed out that sanctions on Iranian oil exports have nothing to do with the desire to strengthen the nuclear non-proliferation. It is aimed at stifling the Iranian economy and the population in an apparent hope to provoke discontent. Most importantly, Russia has decided that it will not cower in the face of British intimidation. President Medvedev made this much clear in a 10-minute video statement last November, addressing the ABM missile system which an Obama-run United States continue to escalate around Russia. Medvedev put forth an offer for joint defense between the Russian nation and the United States and NATO as an alternative. Otherwise, President Medvedev warned, Russia is prepared to respond militarily to the threats posed against it. And as a response to the Russian resistance, the British, in the recent months, have pulled every trick out of the bag to sabotage or even eliminate the leadership of Russia, from cultivating so-called democracy movements to death threats to war.
Russia is divided between those who are willing to stand up to Putin's regime and those who, out of fear, or for personal gain, or even just habit, favor its continuation. Dread of chaos and repression, Russians often say, is in their genes, and overcoming such genetic patrimony takes guts, plus the certainty that what is to come will be better than the present. Trepidation and inveterate pessimism are motivating some people to stand by the devil they know.
This vile piece of journalism from Bloomberg is just a sample in a recent volley of open attacks against presidential candidate Putin. This is not aggressive journalism or muckraking. This is part of a highly organized offensive to destroy Russia from within. In a multi-part report which is now posted on LaRouchePAC.com and circulating throughout Russia, EIR's Rachel Douglas illustrates how a destabilized Russia operation is being run and funded straight out of Britain and the likes of drug pusher George Soros. Take the events surrounding the Russian parliamentary elections on December 4th, which yielded a simple majority for Putin's United Russia Party. The 2 days following the elections have seen the Project Democracy networks of George Soros, the former head of the Soviet Union Mikhail Gorbachev, and other London-linked promoters of regime change take aim at Russia, with the intention of preventing Vladimir Putin's return to the presidency. Within hours of the Duma election results, the former Soviet premier Gorbachev denounced the results and demanded new elections. Western officials began a pile-on of attacks, with British Foreign Minister William Hague charging the United Russia Party with ballot box stuffing, while Senator John McCain tweeted a message addressed to Putin, which read, "Dear Vlad, the Arab Spring is coming to a neighborhood near you." Accompanying these attacks were cries of vote fraud from polling organizations funded by foreign entities typified by the National Endowment for Democracy. Golos, for example, is one of the supposedly independent vote monitoring groups inside Russia that have received NED funding since 2000. And what do they have to show for it? Besides declaring vote fraud before the elections even took place, Golos was paying its observers a set amount of money for each reported case of vote fraud. Not to our surprise, the same foreign sources are also behind the instigators of the street demonstrations that erupted the day after the December 4th elections. Among the crowd of demonstrators was one internet celebrity, Alexei Navalny, shouting slogans against Putin. Contrary to the belief that he is some sort of organic leader, Navalny is also another recipient of NED funds. President Obama's choice of Michael McFaul as the new ambassador to Russia is also an integral part of this insidious operation to create dissidence and chaos inside Russia. For the record, Mr. McFaul is no ambassador, and he is not a diplomat. He is a self-proclaimed agent of influence, and, like U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Susan Rice, has been groomed by the regime change projects of Oxford, and cultivated with the narrow agenda of promoting so-called democratic movements and toppling governments for geopolitical purposes. As he stated in an interview with Slon.ru in June of 2011, most Russian watchers are diplomats or specialists on security and arms control, or Russian culture. I am neither. I can't recite Pushkin by heart. However, McFaul has distinguished himself in one area. I am a specialist in democracy, anti-dictatorial movements, and revolutions. What and who is the target of what McFaul calls democracy? Anyone who defends the sovereignty of their nation. And this is currently embodied in the persons of Prime Minister Putin and President Medvedev. In this context, Ambassador McFaul assumed his position in Moscow on January 16, 2012. And on January 17th, McFaul's second day on the job, he met with his most important contacts, not the leadership of Russia, but the leaders of the opposition groups. But McFaul's intentions are not so surprising to those who are aware of his credentials. During the January 18th State of the Union address by Lyndon LaRouche, the question came from a veteran Russian human rights activist. I know people who were told by Mr. McFaul personally that when he came to the Soviet Union in the late 1980s and early 1990s on various democratization projects, he was never interested in achieving democracy as such, but rather in collapsing the Soviet Union. On Monday, January 16th, McFaul presented his credentials. On Tuesday, he met with representatives of the liberal opposition to the Kremlin. Has Michael McFaul been sent here with the same intention of breaking up Russia as he had toward the Soviet Union over 20 years ago? And the attacks do not stop here. Thinly veiled, if not completely naked death threats have been made against the persons of Medvedev and Putin. In addition to a February 7th foreign policy article disgustingly titled, "Putin is already dead," and hostile remarks uttered by political figures like Senator John McCain, who pointed to Muammar Gaddafi's murder as a warning to Putin and Chinese leaders. President Medvedev, speaking to a group of students on January 25th, was asked whether or not he is prepared to face execution like Saddam Hussein. An acute revolutionary situation is now brewing in the country. Are you ready to face responsibility? Do you realize that you could even be condemned to death? Are you ready to take it bravely, just like Saddam Hussein did? Or will you emigrate to friendly North Korea? To which Medvedev unflinchingly answered, "You probably asked the most courageous question of your life. If you need a precise answer, of course, I am ready to die for my ideals." This is the tension of the present moment. How it will be resolved depends on what happens here in the United States. Russia and China have demonstrated a level of resistance to the British war drive. But ultimately, the decision to lead the world in a Pacific alliance or doom humanity to annihilation is ours to make.
And the target will be that one day, as of now, on one day, when exactly we don't know, but probably knowing the way things are, if President or prospective President Putin is elected, I don't think the British Obama will let him survive. And the way that will happen is just think of all these weapons, these thermonuclear weapons, just those in the U.S. Navy capability. Do you have any idea what that capability is? Do you consider what happens if they intend to do that? Now our military is resisting that, resisting it strongly. The question is, their resistance going to be effective against a president of the United States who's trying to ram this through? That's our problem. So we have the option of removing this guy from office, preventing the launching of an attack on Russia, China, and other nations of Asia, which would be probably the full naval fleet, the submarine fleet, with its capability. The minute that fleet launches those warheads in the direction of Russia, China, etc., at that moment, Russia and China will respond by putting its own warheads into operation, thermonuclear warheads. Do you know what that means? That's what you face.